What is happening, friends? Hope all you guys are having a good day, whatever time of day it happens to be where you're at. Good afternoon, good morning, good night, whatever, right? Appreciate all you who are stopping by. This is not going to be our regularly scheduled programming, for lack of a better term. This is a debate we're having. I think this might actually be only the second debate I've had on this channel, so that's definitely pretty cool. But I appreciate all you guys who are here. We're going to have a conversation today on the party switch betwixt me and Nakasuchi, the Raging Atheist, who, of course, many of you will be familiar with. But those of you who aren't, that's okay. We'll have some introductions here in just a sec. Before we do, I have some brief channel housekeeping to get to. First things first, I want to let you guys know we are going to be back to doing regular Watchdogs again. I know this is probably like the 45th time that you've heard me say that, but it's going to be the 45th time that I'm attempting to do them. So try and tune in every Tuesday and Thursday at noon Mountain Time for an hour-long episode of The Watchdog. It is my political podcast, talk show, whatever you want to call it. We got a lot of important news to get to, and obviously we haven't done an episode in like 3 weeks. So there's like a sort of a what do you call that? Backlog, I guess, of information that we want to be getting to. Another thing I want to remind you guys of, because some of you guys don't watch my other channel, in August, we are going to be doing a conversation on Christian views about United States history. There's a lot of particulars, to actually get set in stone so far, but the idea is to be going live 4 p.m. Mountain Time on August the 1st. It's going to be me, Pastor Phil Fox, apologist in Detroit, Chris Samuel, and potentially Chris Morey from Vlogging Through History. So that might be a huge video there. I think it's going to be a very important video. All the guests on the panel have very relevant experience to the question. Pastor Phil Fox is a Native American who was born on the res. Apologist in Detroit is of course, well, I say of course, I guess some of you guys probably don't know him. Is that an African-American man who grew up in the ghetto, who has a lot of experience with the different sort of racial experiences of a black person in America. Chris Morey is a historian, and all three of them are pastors. So I think it's going to be a great conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. We, again, want to make sure we're getting everything set in stone so that it's something that doesn't go haywire in any sort of a way, but it might be, as far as my own opinion at least, the biggest episode of anything on the other channel that I've had. And it's very relevant to the discussions we have on this channel. So if you only watch this channel, consider tuning into that channel around August for that conversation. We don't really have much as far as the channel housekeeping is getting to today. You're probably going to see me do some trailing of the Ammon Bundy campaign here, but I don't have anything set. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump right into our conversation today. Thank you for being here, Knock, and go ahead and introduce yourself in case there is some people here who may not know you.
Oh, yeah, I appreciate it. I'm the Raging Atheist. I go by Nakasuchi here on the internet. I'm an atheist. I do a lot of conversations when it comes to religion, but as well as politics. And so I'm looking forward to the political debate we're going to have today.
Absolutely, and thank you. And for those of you who do not know, the conversation today is going to be on the United States party switch. We're going to be asking the question, basically, did it happen? I'll be taking the position that it did not. Knock will be taking the position that it did. And we're going to go through about 12 minutes of opening statement, probably about 8 to 10 minutes of rebuttal after. We'll do a 30 to 60-minute open conversation after that. And I know that we don't tend to get big crowds here, but if we do have questions, then we will do a Q&A after that point in time. If not, we'll just go ahead and go right into a 5-minute closing statement and call it good.
Cool.
If you guys do have questions, tag me at the Synagogue News. Make sure it's the Synagogue News, because I won't actually see it light up if you just do the Synagogue. This is technically a different channel name. And yeah, appreciate all you guys being here. I guess we didn't establish who was going first.
I'm the affirmative, so I assumed I would be.
For sure. We'll go ahead and do that then. So let me go ahead and get this set up for 12. And Knock, I will start on your first word.
Awesome. First off, I would like to thank CJ for inviting me to have this debate. It's a debate we've talked about having for quite a while now. several debates that we talked about having for quite a while, and we're finally starting to get to some of them. And this is the first one. Looking forward to it. To begin this, we have to understand two very important things. The first is until the 1960s, when the flip started to really come into its full fruition, both parties had a range of people all across the political spectrum. There were Republican liberals. Theodore Roosevelt was practically a Republican progressive, and there were Democrat conservatives. Not like it is today in the age of partisanship that we live. In fact, the Democrats were dominated by conservatism for most of their history. Now, my opponent is likely to give you just some good sound bites he most likely picked up from Dinesh D'Souza, as well as others that have taken up this anthem that the party flip was a myth. But the party flip is history, and I hope to lay that history out here today. So the Republican Party was first established in 1854 and were considered a fringe party for its first few years, even though they were mainly the remnant of the old Whig Party that couldn't come to an agreement over what to do on the issue of slavery. Made up mostly of the abolitionists of that old Whig Party in a time when the country was truly starting to split over slavery, Republican power was established with the election of Abraham Lincoln, who stayed away from his party's abolitionist positions as much as he could, but he also stayed away from campaigning as much as he could. It didn't really matter because Lincoln's election to president further split the North and South, and we all know the Civil War happened and the history that is there. Through the last half of the 1800s, especially after the Civil War, Republican power was consolidated to the North and to the West. The Democratic Party, who was the party of the KKK and primarily made up of Southern conservatives, was consolidated mainly to the South. But like I said, both parties shared people with opposing political views. Both held moderates of all types as well. Both politics were geographical. If you were a Northern Democrat, you were more likely a liberal. And if you were a Southern Republican, you were more likely a conservative. That would blur a bit once the populist era hit, which was followed by the progressive movement. Both parties embraced these concepts, and both parties became very similar in platform for a few decades. By the time Calvin Coolidge ran against Democrat John Davis in 1924, the populists thought the two were the same, and it really didn't matter who won. That would begin to change in 1929, when Herbert Hoover, a conservative Republican, won the presidency. It was in his presidency when the world economy collapsed and the Great Depression hit. Hoover put a lot of money into the economy, but nothing would work. The Hoover Dam seemed to be the final straw. The great project turned the people against him, but more importantly, it turned a certain demographic against him, and that was the black vote. They had been the party of emancipation, after all, where the Democrats still to that day mainly opposed it. Hoover is blamed for the Great Depression here in America, though, and it had really nothing to do with his presidency, at least not much. He had pumped a lot of money into the economy, into stimulus, and just nothing was working because the world economy was crashing. But he had been the Commerce Secretary under Coolidge, and his policies beneath that administration are largely blamed for the Great Depression here in America. Whatever the reason, the Great Depression would cripple the Republican Party, as Democrats would pick up 8 seats in the Senate and 52 seats in the House in the 1930 midterms. In 1932, FDR destroys Hoover, and the Democrats gain 12 more seats in the Senate and 92 in the House. FDR would also get 72% of the black vote, the first time African Americans ever went with the Democrats, mainly because FDR's Great New Deal sounded a lot like his cousin, Republican Theodore Roosevelt, who was a beloved former president and had a lot of the same policies. This was a huge swing, but it was mainly a protest vote against Hoover, who everyone blamed for their economic hardships. After being routed by FDR, he would spend his entire life bitter and rail against the Democrats, FDR's big government, liberalism, and federal intervention in economic affairs. FDR's New Deal initiative, while not doing much for the black community, if we are honest, did turn the framing around the Democratic Party. They were still full of those Southern conservatives who were still against emancipation and responsible for Jim Crow. But now they were starting to be known as the party that was for organized labor, while the Republicans, since Lincoln, had always been for big business. By 1948, the Democratic Party had taken a huge swing from its roots, and while there were still many Southern conservatives in the party itself adopted anti-racist platforms. In 1948, the Democratic platform included this: the Democratic Party is responsible for the great civil rights gains in recent years in eliminating illegal discrimination based on race, creed, or color. President Truman would sign Executive Order 9981, which desegregated the military. All of this would make the Southern Democrats very angry, enough so to start their own party, which they called the State Rights Democratic Party. This party would become known as the Dixiecrats, whose platform was to keep the South segregated and under Jim Crow laws. Then in 1954, a historical Supreme Court case ruling came down. Brown versus the Board of Education made it illegal to segregate public schools. This sudden change would cause a lot of political turmoil, and we saw the country split once again over segregation, and primarily the split was, again, the liberal North and the liberal West versus the conservative South. In comes the Southern strategy. At this crucial juncture, when civil rights had become mainstream and the country was split into two camps, and it was a real electoral strategy employed by Republicans to increase Republican support in the South by appealing to the existing racism there against African American communities. The strategy's origins can be found in what is known as the Southern Manifesto, a document written in response to the Brown ruling. It mainly called for states' rights, stating that the federal government should stop trying to overturn state law. 19 senators and 82 representatives would sign the manifesto, most of whom were Southern Democrats. Southern Democrats, in the face of civil rights and feeling betrayed, as they saw it, by their own party, began to caucus with Southern Republicans to vote against civil rights legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1957, 1960, as well as the more popular Act of 1964. They would also caucus with Republicans to get Barry Goldwater elected. He got blown out. Goldwater was against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but for a constitutional reason. He was not a racist. He had voted for a previous civil rights bill. As well, he was a member of the NAACP. But that didn't stop the Southern Democrats from trying to get him elected in an attempt to stop the spread of equality that was sweeping through the country. Goldwater would be routed by LBJ, and after his defeat, he was worried that his support of integration would continue to lose some support among conservatives, and he was right. Southern conservatives had drawn their line, and segregation was their only issue. State rights was their mantra. When Richard Nixon would run in 1968, again, he was hoping to get a lot of those angry voters in the South, but was upstaged by a third-party candidate, George Wallace, a Dixiecrat who is most famous for the saying, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. Kevin Phillips, who was a Republican strategist that worked with the Nixon campaign in 68, wrote the book on the Southern strategy and would popularize it in 1970 when the New York Times would publish an interview with him. In that interview, he is quoted as saying, "From now on, Republicans are never going to get more than 10 to 20% of the Negro vote, and they don't need any more than that. But Republicans would be short-sighted if they weakened enforcement on the Voter Rights Act. The more Negroes that register as Democrats in the South, the sooner the negrophobe whites will quit the Democrats and become Republicans. That's where the votes are, and without that prodding from the blacks, the whites will backslide into their old, comfortable arrangement with the local Democrats." This was the thing, because even though the politics were shifting quickly, humans tend to stick with what they are familiar with. Human beings don't like change. And when they have voted Democrat their entire life, when their father voted Democrat, when their father's father voted Democrat, it's hard to change overnight. It takes time. But Republicans did see some immediate gains with their Southern strategy, as shown in the 1970 midterms when Albert Gore Sr., father to Vice President Gore, lost his re-election bid to Republican Bill Brock. Despite that, it was Richard Nixon that would begin to win the South for the Republicans, as he won nearly the entire country in 1972. But then Watergate would devastate the Republican Party. It could have ended the Republican Party, in my opinion, as the Dems ran a Southern Democrat in 1976 who did really well in the South despite his record for integration and civil rights, and that was Jimmy Carter. But in 1976, another historical Supreme Court ruling would come down and begin to split the country among ideological lines once again. Roe v. Wade finally provided the inroad to taking the South once and for all from the Democrats. Before 1976, most Republicans were pro-choice. But from 1976 on, the Republican Party would make its platform pro-life. And from that point, Republicans would dominate the socially conservative vote. They had the evangelical vote now, which was their key to owning the South as their power base. In the 80s, Republicans are pro-life and their counterparts are pro-choice mainly. We're still some moderates on both sides, but by now the political shift has happened and Republicans would begin to win the Southern vote. Lee Atwater would admit that Republicans had kept the Southern strategy going through the 70s, which it had very plainly. It had turned the South from the staunch Democratic states to swing states during the 70s and 80s. By the 90s, those old Southern Democrats had pretty much died off, and the South was the firm base of the Republican Party. And this is where you can see another shift as Republicans would slowly begin to stop utilizing the Southern strategy and make attempts to gain minority votes as well, but would not gain much roads until Bush Jr. Would make significant inroads with the the Latin American community. That would turn against him by the middle of his presidency, though, when an overwhelming majority of Latino Americans voted for John Kerry. In more recent times, movements like Brexit and Democratic refusal to have a backbone for sweeping social change has begun to swing the pendulum once again. Dinesh D'Souza would make his name on saying the party switch is a myth and that never happened, using half-truths and sometimes outright lies to do so. But the truth of the matter is that the party switch isn't a switch of one party or another. What was that? Oh, sorry. Democrats.
Stay in 1 minute. I got to pause right now. Those.
All right. I'm pretty much almost done, I think. Yeah. All right. So Democrats did not become Republicans, or Republicans did not become Democrats. It was a shift in power bases, a shift that took nearly 100 years to make. Humans are tribal and resist change. So it was a long road to the current political map we have in the modern day. The city dweller versus the country conservative. And many factors were involved. The Great Depression played a role. Civil rights played a role. Abortion played a role. But what we have is undeniable. The old Republican Party, the liberal party of emancipation, is gone, replaced by a party that embraced conservatism. And the Democrats, while they placate minority groups, for the most part, it has been a process of dragging them kicking and screaming toward real social change. The party flip happened. It's history. It does not mean that current Republicans are all racist or even support the Southern strategy. It means the Republicans that had been primarily liberal on social issues had become conservative, and the other way around for the Democrats. That's all it means. And I'm sure my opponent will agree with me that Republicans are now primarily conservatives while Democrats are primarily liberal, though I think that last part would be the more interesting debate here. So with that, I'm done. Thank you.
Absolutely. And appreciate the opening statement there. Let me go ahead and get my time started here. And here we go. All right. So this won't be a direct rebuttal to what Knock just said. That's what we got the next 8 minutes for. Although I will say, shocker, I actually agree with about 50 to 60% of what was just said there. So this is going to be a fun one. But besides that, let's get to my actual opening statement today, right? Because that's what this 12 minutes is for. So I am not here today to defend two things that may be tempting for somebody who believes in the party switch to grasp, or not grasp, but to jump on, right? The first thing is I am not here to defend the notion that the South itself did not switch from primarily Democratic to primarily Republican. That did happen. I think it didn't really solidly happen until about the year 2000, and we'll get into some of the evidence of that, but that certainly did happen. You can look at any presidential map as evidence of that. The second thing that I am not going to be here to defend is I'm not going to be here to defend the idea that the issues don't change in some way, right? What I mean by that is in the 1968 election, people were not talking about abortion. In the 1980 election, people were not talking about homosexuality. And in the 2000 election, people were not primarily talking about things like universal health care. The point is, as time goes on, issues change, right? We've obviously left issues behind just as well as we've gained some. For example, we're no longer talking about whether or not slavery should be legal. We're no longer talking about what we should do as far as the Native Americans who were fighting, right? We're no longer talking about whether or not we should expand into the rest of the North American continent. All these things happened in the past, and we got new issues as we moved on into the future. So those are two things that I'm not going to be here to argue against, right? The South certainly has become more red as time has gone on, and issues have, of course, come and gone
as time has gone on. So what I am going to be here to defend is this. The idea of the party switch primarily is an idea that Republicans actually wanted to, or not wanted to, but had a strategy of adopting what we might call racist policies as a means of gaining the white vote. And I don't believe that that occurred. I don't believe there is any evidence that the Republican Party moved towards supporting things like segregation. I don't believe there's any evidence that they moved towards supporting things like interracial marriage laws, which there's a word for that, but I don't remember what it is. I don't believe that it was the Republicans moving forward to support things like the KKK or things like that. And that's typically what people mean by the party switch, is that on civil rights issues, everything switched around, specifically on civil rights issues. I don't believe that's the case, and then we're going to get into some of the reasons why I don't believe that. But first, I want to go ahead and show you guys some interesting things here online. The first thing we're going to look at is some of the presidential elections and the maps of those presidential elections so that we can see just how long it actually took for these southern states to switch. This is important because if in the 1960s and 70s there was a concerted effort on the part of Republicans and conservatives to adopt more racist language and more racist policies, then it would make sense for the South back in the time when they were incredibly racist to have been supporting the Republicans. It wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for them to be supporting the Republicans after that had already occurred. For example, right now, if you were to go, I'm not saying there's no racism in the South, by the way, that's not my claim, but it's clearly less pronounced 2020 than it was 1960. I think everybody would agree to that. So if we look at the presidential maps here, we'll see a lot of interesting things. This is starting in 1960. Looks like it's a little bit cut off here. I don't know why that is, but I apologize. And as you can see, the majority of these southern states are actually supporting the Democratic candidate at the time, which would have been John F. Kennedy. There's a few exceptions. Florida here, Tennessee here. You see Virginia, Kentucky also. But for the most part, this is very well dominated by the Democratic Party. And we're going to see that continue as we move forward here pretty quickly. 1964 is going to be a little bit of an exception for us, but not as much as you might think. We see here, and by the way, I appreciate that Knock was willing to concede that Barry Goldwater is not a racist. A lot of people do like to slander Barry Goldwater as a racist. He most certainly was not. He had very deep ideological reasons for not supporting the Civil Rights Amendment. But nonetheless, you can see that not supporting the Civil Rights Amendment did gain him some support in the Deep South, particularly 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the states that we would call the traditional Bible Belt. But notice that's not even the majority of the traditional Bible Belt. Oklahoma, Texas, Florida, Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, so on and so forth. All in all, about 10 to 11, depending on which states you include in the Bible Belt, supported Lyndon B. Johnson here, who himself was a Texas Democrat. Only 5 actually would support Barry Goldwater, and so it certainly wasn't a massive switch, although it was a little bit of break in trend. In 1968, you have Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is going to have more support here than Humphreys is, but as you can see, we have the majority of, well, not the majority, it's about actually the same as Barry Goldwater, but nonetheless, about 5 of the states here for George Wallace. Then you have another probably about, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 for Nixon, and then you have 1 for Humphreys. Big thing that it's important to notice here is that George Wallace was a Democrat, a lifelong Democrat, in fact. Here, he would be running for a states' rights kind of party. I think he called it the America First Party. But nonetheless, after this, he was a Democrat. And before this, he was a Democrat. It actually says American Independent Party here, so there's a little correction for me there. 1972 comes along. And 1972 is a little bit of an interesting year only because, as you can see, Nixon won basically everything ever. Believe it or not, Nixon was actually an intensely popular president at one point in time before the whole Watergate thing. And the only time we would actually see this happen again as we move forward would be Ronald Reagan in 1984. And we'll obviously be getting there in a second. But obviously, you can't single this out as saying, oh, well, Nixon won the South, because Nixon won everything, with the exception of Massachusetts. Moving forward, 1976, you see, now this is a good time after the Civil Rights Bill has been passed, right? We are 8 years past the most recent Civil Rights Bill. We are, at this point, 12 years past the very first of them, the Civil Rights Voting Act, which I believe was 1964. It might have been 1965, but it's in that era. And you can see complete and total domination of the Bible Belt on the part of Jimmy Carter. There's a couple states here, namely Virginia and Oklahoma, which are in the Bible Belt and are voting red at this point. But for the most part, it is completely and totally dominated by Jimmy Carter, who himself was a Southern Democrat, being from the state of Georgia. Next year, you have 1980. 1980 is Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is, again, an intensely popular person. And so we see complete domination of the entire map, even more pronounced in his next election, which I had actually previously referenced, where he will lose one single state, namely the state of Minnesota. And I'll go ahead and show you guys the map right there. Moving on to 1988, we're trying to get through this very quickly because there's other things I want to get to. Moving on to 1988, we see George Bush and Michael Dukakis. And again, you have complete domination of the map by the Republicans, which, by the way, it is interesting to note, when we had these dominations all around, they do tend to be on the side of the Republican Party. There is a reason for that, and I personally believe that issues like segregation and racism are a big part of that reason. I think the Democratic Party, for a long period of time, was starting to get a reputation as kind of a nasty party. That's not really the case anymore, although it is if you're in more conservative circles. If you're in your liberal circles, however, it tends to be something that is not, it's the other way around. They look at the Republicans as the nasty party. But nationally speaking, virtually everybody saw the Democratic Party as a fairly nasty party at that time, a party that used paramilitary wings, a party that was racially discriminatory against half of the population, a party that did, I guess it wouldn't be half, probably about a third of the population, considering blacks, Native Americans, Latinos, etc., right? A party that was not particularly, shy from using the state to actually go ahead and enforce what it wanted to enforce. See FDR, see Huey Long, etc., etc. Although Nixon definitely tainted that a little bit on the Republican side as well. 1992 comes around, and this is very interesting. Notice the Bible Belt is fairly split. So if you look at the Bible Belt here, the Bible Belt, by the way, for those of you who don't know, is the entire former Confederate South, the 5 border states, and the state of Oklahoma right here. And you can see a good deal of those states are blue. Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, Georgia, Louisiana. All in all, just about half of the states are going blue, and just about half of the states are going red in Bill Clinton's election. This is only 1992, 6 years before I was born, and over 3 decades after the supposed party switch is taking place, right? And remember, we did have domination of the Bible Belt by red states, but we had domination of the entire map by the Republican Party during those elections. So it's not something you can look at as an outlier. Bill Clinton, again, would split the Bible Belt about 50-50 in 1996. Here we see a nice little chain of red states right here, also Texas. And then we see a nice little chain of blue states right here, also Florida. Once again, you see that the Bible Belt is split relatively 50-50. And in fact, some of the states we look at as more conservative, Louisiana, Florida, Tennessee, they're voting blue. Some of the states that we would look at as a little bit more liberal, for example, Virginia, voting red. So we can see here that things have certainly switched through time. And 2000 is when you really start to see the Bible Belt dominated by Republicans, and it will continue on basically up until the current point we're in after this. Every Bible Belt state is voting for Bush in 2000. Obviously, you can see there's a good deal of blue here on the map. And in fact, Al Gore ended up even winning the popular vote. So it is an outlier at that point in time. Same thing happens in 2004. Scroll down here, complete domination of the Bible Belt by George Bush, and obviously outliers elsewhere. Again, a very close election. You can actually see the popular vote here. 48.3% was John Kerry, 251 electoral votes for John Kerry. So it was a very close election. It by no means was a runaway like what we saw with Reagan and Nixon. And again, you can look at the Bible Belt as an outlier there. Barack Obama comes in 2008. We do see a little bit of blue there in the Bible Belt. Virginia, North Carolina, Florida. For the most part, it's not there. Republican, 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 Republican. And we can go on to the other three, elections as well. But the point has been made. And in those 3 elections, you'll see the same thing. In fact, the most blue it gets is in 2020, which was our most recent election. And I think that Georgia and Virginia are the only states that actually ended up going for the Democrats at that time. But nonetheless, obviously, that's a little bit more than complete and total domination of the map, right? That's actually the end of my time there. So we'll go ahead and get to some of the other stuff here later. I want to talk about the Republican Party platforms in previous years, as well as a bunch of other things. But you can see here, in my opinion, what is the actual case, which is it takes a long time for the Bible Belt to actually become red. And by the time it does become red, issues like segregation are no longer on the ballot. With that, Knock, you have 8 minutes. And go ahead and start whenever you're ready.
Awesome. I appreciate it. I appreciate that opening. I appreciate you bringing out the maps. I was considering on doing it in my opening as well. I probably would have went back a little farther all the way to the beginning of the Republican Party, but I think you did a fairly decent job. But I want to point out that, so at first, CJ pretty much conceded the debate. He admits that the flip happened, but he admits that it doesn't happen until 2000. And that's the main gist of his opening statement was, well, you know, if this flip happened, it took a really, really long time. But that's the history. That's what happened. It took a long time. You know, he said he believed it came to its fruition in 2000, but it really came to its fruition in 94. He was showing that the political map there at the end there of the 94 election. And on the national level, true, it was some Democrats won some states there. But 94 is known as the Republican Revolution, where they took the South, and they took it on, you know, in Congress, they took it on the state and local level, sweeping victories across the board in 94. But that's the point of a strategy is it, you know, when you come up with a strategy, you're coming up with a long-term solution to your issue, right? So the fact that it took a long time speaks to the strategy that they were willing to carry that strategy out for such a long time. And to notice the fruitions of the strategy and try to say, well, that's evidence against the strategy being utilized doesn't make much sense to me. CJ said he doesn't really believe that the Southern strategy occurred, but he never really gave any reasoning for that. Bush in 2003, leading up to his, his re-election of 2004, during that campaign, directly utilized the Southern strategy as well as LGBTQ plus hate to win re-election in a very close run against John Kerry. A lot of people thought John Kerry was going to win that election, but Bush really went pretty shady in that campaign. Several Republicans have admitted to utilizing Southern strategy, like I pointed out in my opening. Lee Atwood, most recently, I believe Mitch McConnell admitted that yes, from the 60s to the 90s, they were pretty much utilizing, or from the 70s throughout the 90s, they were pretty much utilizing Southern strategy. And you can see it in the politics. You can see it in the modern day when I thought I knocked my headphones out. I knocked something out. I knocked something out of my headphones. You can see it in the modern day when with the current strategies of anti-immigration, border hunting. These are old school race politics that derived from the Southern strategy. Now, my position is that the Republican Party had mainly gotten away from the Southern strategy, but it's coming back into play now here in more recent times. It's no longer mainly about race. I do agree with that. CJ made that point. But race still has a very large role to play play in it. You know, we haven't had a civil rights bill in quite a long time. CJ's right. It's not really on the political cards now to have like a new civil rights bill, but we do still see unrest in those communities from a lack of civil rights, from a lack of equality. So the solution has not been taken care of, and people in the South, not all of them, but many of them still do harbor those old hatreds. I know this from personal experience because I grew up in the Bible Belt. I'm not saying everybody's a racist, but some of those old sentiments are still harbored quietly most often, but sometimes not so quietly as well. George Wallace was not a quote unquote Democrat when he ran against Nixon. I think CJ did kind of recognize that he was running as a third party candidate, and it really kind of screwed up Nixon's chance to win that election. But like the rest of the Dixiecrats, he did go back to the Democratic Party, which I guess you can say, yeah, they're Democrats, but they were caucusing with the Southern conservatives against civil rights legislature, as well as caucusing to win presidencies with the Southern Democrats or with the Southern Republicans, because the South has always been conservative. So that's the ideology down South. Up North, it was always liberal. Now, those lines have blurred. I think that the Republican Party and the right has done much better at spreading their ideology across the country than the Democrats have. I think, you know, what used to be Confederates confined to the South, you can now find them pretty much anywhere in the country. Almost done. So the main point, like I said, is it took so long to flip. But that's the point of the strategy. They understood that it was going to take a long time to flip. The Democrats had seen that when it comes to the African-American community vote. I pointed out in my opening, the first time they ever went with Democrats was FDR's Great New Deal. But then they went right back to the Republicans, even though it was becoming more and more apparent that Republicans were for big business and not so much for their civil rights anymore. Yet they continue to stay with Republicans, just like a lot of Southern conservatives would continue to stay with Democrats because that's what made them comfortable. But the Democratic Party platform changed, as did this Republican Party platform. And that's the whole point of the flip. It's not that Democrats became Republicans. That's never the point. You know, if people are saying that, they're just being stupid. The party flip happened with political ideology and philosophy. It wasn't a matter of trading members. And eventually those old Southern Dixiecrats would eventually die off, and the Democratic Party would become what it is today. Now, you also referenced, you know, some of the 80s and early 90s where the electoral map was kind of split between Democrat and Republicans. And that goes to the history. That goes to my opening statement. The strategy was pretty much immediately effective because it turned it from a staunch blue Democratic Southern belt to a swing state Southern belt. It's, you know, now it's the Midwest that's pretty much the swing states. Back then it was those Southern states, because the Southern strategy was so successful, because Democrats were becoming more for civil rights, getting more of that minority vote, and Republicans weren't. You're actually noting the progression of the strategy in your opening statement there, and kind of backing up my points when you do so. You made a point like Republicans had dominated the political map several times, which made it an outlier. I totally agree. Democrats had done it several times as well throughout the history of the country. FDR obliterated Hoover. So I believe that's pretty much it. 94, the Republican. Yeah. And just to reiterate, it was really in 94 when the Republican Revolution happened in the Southern Belt. They just had sweeping wins across the board, even though nationally, who was it? I believe it was Bill Clinton. He was Southern, so he did pretty well in the South. But the real revolution, when the Southern strategy came to its fruition, was in 94. It happened. It's history. I do understand that a lot of liberals will come up here and espouse a lot of different things. We get stuff wrong. We listen to propaganda as well. But this notion that the party flip didn't happen is just wrong. It doesn't make anybody a racist or not a racist. This is just history. I would not support the Democratic Party of the late 1800s through the mid 1900s if I were alive back then. I barely support them now. So that's it. That's all I got.
All righty, thank you. And we'll go ahead and reset the timer here. All right. So I want to point out a couple of things here as we continue forward. The first thing is just to reiterate, we have to understand what the claim of the party switch is. The claim of the party, those who advocate for the party switch, is not simply that there was a change in the electoral map. Everybody agrees there's been changes in the electoral map. Rather, and we actually kind of heard this reiterated, it is a claim of a changing in the ideology or platform that governs each party in regards to racial issues. And that is actually what I think is in dispute. I don't think there is dispute as far as the South changing to be more conservative. I think there's a dispute as to why they changed to be more conservative. And for the record, if you were to look at guys like your Dinesh D'Souza's, your Ben Shapiro's, your Tucker Carlson's, those mainstream voices on the right these days, that is the claim that they make as well. They're not claiming the electoral map didn't shift. They're not claiming that the voting demographics didn't shift. Rather, they're claiming that the political platforms that govern each party did not shift. And that's what I'm here to defend as well. I think in the opening statement, we actually saw some examples of exactly why we know that to be the case. For example, it was referenced that in 1973, Roe v. Wade turned abortion into a national issue. Well, that made a lot of people who were in the South, who would otherwise not have voted for the Republicans on social issues, start to look towards the Republicans and give them a second look on social issues. But notice, Roe v. Wade is not a race issue. Roe v. Wade, if anything, would be a women's rights issue. And as far as I'm concerned, being a conservative who's pro-life, I don't even consider it to be that. I consider it to be rights for the unborn. Notice the point there, though. Whether you believe it's rights for the unborn or believe it's rights for women, either way, it's not a race issue, right? It's not a shift on civil rights as it pertains to racial integration or anything like that. A similar thing occurred in the as far as the voting for homosexuality and things of that nature. I don't know why it took me to get that. My apologies. The homosexual issue was not an issue that was dominating politics back in the 50s, back in the 60s, back in the 70s. Again, regardless of what you happen to think about that issue, whether you're right wing, left wing, doesn't matter. The point is, when conservatives in the South start to say, hey, we don't like that, these are not conservatives in the South saying, hey, we don't like that racial policy of the Democrats. They're saying, hey, we don't like that social policy as it pertains to homosexual marriage. Not a race issue, right? There's a couple things we can actually get to that I think further demonstrate that. And actually, it's kind of a little bit of providence that I ended up not getting to some of these points in my opening statement. This is Nixon, from the Richard Nixon Foundation, which is obviously going to be pro Richard Nixon. It's a little bit biased towards him, but it's going to demonstrate some of the things that I think show us that he himself was not actually an ally of some of the pro-segregation Democrats in the late 60s and early 70s. Here we see him shaking Martin Luther King's hand. That doesn't really mean anything, right? Because anybody can shake anybody's hand. Well, let's actually get to some of the stuff he actually did. So Nixon as vice president, quote, the Eisenhower administration accomplished much in the area of civil rights. It was President Eisenhower who integrated the armed forces, promoted more blacks into the federal bureaucracy than his predecessors, and appointed federal judges, lawyers, in his Justice Department, who supported racial justice. 1954, the World War II general also sent the U.S. National Guard to integrate Little Rock's Central High School to enforce the 1954 unanimous Supreme Court decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, which held that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal and overturned. This goes on to talk a little bit more about Eisenhower, but we're obviously interested in Nixon. During his second term as vice president, Nixon shepherded through Congress the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. The 1957 legislation empowered the Justice Department to prosecute civil rights cases through a newly established Civil Rights Division and allowed federal prosecutors to obtain court injunctions and the citizens' right to vote when the citizens' right to vote was being obstructed. But what about the stuff he actually did as a president? Because that's the real important stuff, right? President Nixon signed the Voting Rights Act of 1970, nationalizing the 1965 legislation and expanding its reach to northern states. The Nixon administration ended discrimination in companies and labor unions that received federal contracts and set guidelines and goals for affirmative action hiring for African Americans. The policy, known as the Philadelphia Plan, from where it originated, initially included government contracts in excess of $500,000 in construction trade, which with inflation, that would be several million, and later expanded to include $50,000 or more in all areas of industry and quotas for women. By the way, fun fact, Nixon is actually quite liberal from our perspective these days. He's the one who established the EPA. He's the one who opened trade relations with China. So it's not just, something that is related to issues of liberal in the voting sphere, which, by the way, to be clear, I don't actually think the word, I put air quotes there, but I don't actually think the word liberal is necessarily bad in that regard. If you take liberal in its dictionary definition, then all of us who support racial integration would actually be considered liberal on that issue in the 50s and 60s. So I'll actually concede that point. Sometimes things don't need to be conserved, right? If you're in Saudi Arabia and you're a conservative right now, that means you're cool with stoning people for being atheists or Christians. So depending on where you're at in time, conservative and liberal can have varying meanings and varying support behind them. But here we see the point being that Nixon is actually quite progressive, if we will, when it comes to issues of racial integration, even though he's allegedly, according to Lee Atwater, the one who's supposed to be against racial integration and utilizing the Southern strategy. Now, this is a very interesting thing to look at. This is from the American Presidency Project, the Republican Party platform of 1928. By the way, I had no idea that Rage was going to reference things like Hoover's election in 1932, or lack of thereof, in 1932, or anything like that. So this actually ended up being a pretty great coincidence here. But nonetheless, let's just look at some of the things that we see in the Republican Party's platform from 1928. And we'll see, I think, quite plainly, that this is basically the same platform that we have in 2020, with the exception that new issues have come about, for example, things like abortion and so on. National administration. We endorse without qualification the record of the Coolidge administration. The record of the Republican Party is a record of advancement of the nation. Nominees of Republican National Conventions have, for 52 of the 72 years since the creation of our party, been the chief executives of the United States. Under Republican inspiration and largely under Republican executives' direction, the continent has been bound with steel rails. The oceans and great rivers have been joined by canals. Waterways have been deepened and widened for ocean commerce. And with all, a high American standard of wage and living has been established. Tell me that doesn't sound exactly like Donald Trump talking about, we're going to build a Keystone pipeline. We're going to start building American industry. We're going to pass tariffs to make sure more companies are building here. And by the way, we're going to get more specific on that latter as we go down. Obviously, we can't read the whole thing. It would take up my whole time, but you guys kind of get the idea. Public economy. The citizen and taxpayer has a natural right to be protected from unnecessary and wasteful expenditures. This is 1928. This is not 2016 post-Tea Party. This is a rich but also growing nation with constantly increasing legitimate demands for public funds. That's my timer there. You'll see finance and taxation. They want lower taxation. They reference the public debt, which is billions rather than millions at this point in time. They reference tariffs, all these other sorts of things. The point is that when it comes to the actual platforms we had, they have not switched as far as ideology is concerned. They have only switched as far as voting demographic is concerned. And I don't think that suffices for what the people are trying to say is the quote party switch. But let's go ahead and get into our back and forth. I went over time, so you go ahead and start.
Well, yeah, but you know, I know you want to say the party switch is something different, but that's literally what the party switch is, and I don't think that you would disagree. You know, you pulled up the 1928, and I mentioned that time period in my opening for a reason, because you know that's the time period right after the populist era, as well as the progressive movement that was hitting, to where both political parties were very, very similar in platforms. So you could probably read the Democratic platform from 1928 and it would read very, very similar to that. Now, Hoover himself was a social as well as a liberal conservative within the Republican Party. And like I also mentioned in my opening statements, that was more the norm back then than it is now. You're not going to find people of wide-ranging political philosophies in the same political party anymore. But back then, that was just the way it went. When it comes to Hoover as well, I forgot that last point. But you mentioned Nixon a lot there in your rebuttal, and I want you to notice that I never really mentioned Nixon a lot. I didn't really credit him with the Southern strategy. I know a lot of liberals do, and history pretty much does as well. I don't really see too much evidence of that outside of one of his strategists came up with the philosophy. Jill, it wasn't a Nixon Republican strategy as far as I know. I mentioned the Southern Manifesto. that's pretty much where it originated. And again, I haven't really heard any evidence that would tell me, no, the Southern strategy did not exist, when we have plenty of evidence of Republicans, even admitting that it did. But notice, like, from what I've gathered of history, you mentioned a lot of accomplishments by Nixon, and I don't think that just because of Watergate, we should not recognize that Nixon did a lot of good things as president. He really did. It was behind the scenes, the things we learned about him behind the scenes from the tapes, as well as people coming out after the whole Watergate thing, really kind of exposing him for the man he was, that we kind of found out that he was a racist bastard behind the scenes. But he carried the black vote in his first election, especially, I believe when he was elected the first time, he carried the black vote. He carried the entire nation's vote, right? So,
but I think there's something that's kind of getting a little bit muddled here, right? Because I agree that the voting demographic does switch over time, right? But
that's the whole party flip. My contention, CJ, and this is where I think that you're erring here, is that a lot of these conservative, I'll call them apologists, the Dinesh D'Souza's, you mentioned a couple of them, they've come out and really they've given a lot of talking points to kind of talk away the Southern strategy. I think it's a good strategy. I think honestly it's been the main way the Republican Party has been able to get away from the Southern strategy, is by kind of coming out with this line of rhetoric, but it is only rhetoric. The flip is essentially the South used to be Democrat conservatives, now it's Democrat Republicans. And you guys use that against us in this argument. You use that against us when you bring up the Democrat was the party of Jim Crow. Like, we're the ones trying to deny that. We're not trying to deny that. That's not the controversy here. The controversy here is that the party of emancipation is now the party that is centered in that conservative South that was the home of slavery. That is the issue. Well, it doesn't make Republicans racist, or that they're even being racist today. It just means that strategy was utilized to win that demographic.
See, but I think that doesn't suffice for what the narrative has been, though, because if we look at what
I'm saying is that narrative comes from your side. It doesn't really come from ours.
See, I don't think that's accurate, though, because when people are saying the party switch, in fact, to give a good example of exactly what I'm talking about in play, Cenk Uygur, I think I said that right, and Ben Shapiro had a debate on the same issue.
Oh yeah, Cenk
right?
is Cenk.
Yeah, and by the way, that debate, for the most part, wasn't very edifying. I don't think it was honest pursuit of truth. It was each.
I don't think I watched that one. I might have watched that one. I can't remember if I watched that one. I know I seen one with Cenk at Politicon. I don't think it was that one though.
Well, he also debated Dinesh D'Souza, so that could be.
Yeah, I think I saw that one. Yeah.
So if we go into that debate, right, one of the things we notice is, and Cenk is not unique here, right? His point is that the political parties switched specifically as it pertains to their ideology in regards to racial integration and civil rights, right?
I find that it is idiocy. That's just idiocy. That's something like I would have said before I ever really looked into it, right?
See, right, but that's kind of where people like me and Shapiro then come forward, right? Because Shapiro, if you have that whole debate, you look at his side, which again, it's not a very good debate, admittedly, but what he then ends up responding with is, look, we're not denying that the South was once blue and is now red. You just got to look at the political maps for that, right? Where the denial, though, comes in is why that's the case. I think a lot of times people will like to point to things like states' rights, say states' rights is kind of like an underhanded way of supporting racism and stuff like that. But really, the states' rights is a super inconsistent issue even today, right? Washington supports the idea of states' rights when it comes to marijuana, and Georgia supports the idea of states' rights when it comes to abortion, and neither support the idea of states' rights when it comes to the other side. You know what I mean? Your
conservative Supreme Court just shot down a New York State law that's been in existence for 100 years when it comes to concealed weapon carry. I think. So what a lot of liberals will focus on in this discussion, I think, is the utilization of the Southern strategy, which is a utilization of racist dog whistles, pretty much speaking underhandedly to where you can still have this air of, hey, I didn't say that to you where you're speaking to the racist and you're saying, hey, we are on your side. And the Southern Republicans really showed that by caucusing with the Dixiecrats in opposition to civil rights. Now, thankfully, they lost that opposition, and we live in the world we live in today. But it's this misutilization of what the political philosophy is. What flipped, I think it was one congressman stopped being a Democrat and started being a Republican, right?
Yeah,
I think it was two House representatives stopped being a Democrat and started being a Republican. What switched was that label of it being the power base. Now, if you look at the Republican power base, it's pretty much suburbia here in the modern era. I think that Republicans have done a really good job of spreading their message and actually getting more people in their tent, because for a long time, I think that they were realizing they were becoming the minority. But at the same time, it's still geographically pretty much your liberals are going to be in the big cities in the north. Your conservatives are going to be in the South. And it was that philosophy of politics. Of course, this came way after civil rights was passed, but now it becomes a drag on trying to get new civil rights legislation passed or new equality measures passed when it comes for different demographics and minorities. And they utilize that strategy now more, not so much in a racist tone, but in a more social justice, culture war type tone against all of the groups that they don't like at the moment.
Well, but hang on though, because I want to zero in on that for a moment, because that I don't even necessarily have disagreement other than the fact that I'm on the opposite side of the culture war there, right? But notice there, that is a fundamental shift in not the ideology of the parties, but in the issues that people are talking about, right? And to give a perfect example of that, I think we could look at the fact that a lot of the people who were supporting things like civil rights integration in the 1960s are still alive today and are supporting things like pro-life legislation. I think the most famous example being the King family, although I don't think every single member is there. But Martin Luther King himself definitely had some very socially conservative views in regards to marriage, in regards to homosexuality and things like that.
Yeah, I know a lot of people try to make him out to be a fake Christian, but he was a pretty solid Southern Baptist, I believe, right?
He's a Southern Baptist preacher. And his theology would be considered heretical by most, but it's not that he didn't believe it. He certainly believed it. He preached it every Sunday, right? So when people say he was a false convert, I think that there's a lot to go into there, right?
A lot of it comes from like the demonization of him back in those times. We don't have to get into all of that.
Yeah. But he was certainly, to your point, he was strongly pro family, strongly pro monogamous marriage, strongly pro heterosexual marriage, things like that. This is the very same guy who's leading the push for racial integration. Louis Farrakhan's another example. Louis Farrakhan has very socially conservative views. He's a Muslim, right? Once again, Nation of Islam Muslim is a little bit different than Sunni Muslim, but nonetheless, he is a Muslim. Malcolm X, very socially conservative views. So when we start talking about, okay, the Republicans are now against things like abortion, homosexual marriage, they're pro monogamous marriage, lifelong monogamous marriage, I should say. Anti-divorce is another way you could put it, right? Those aren't the same issues as things like segregation and issues of slavery and things like that. And one of the big reasons that I think that that's vitally important is because there is a conflict of narratives here, right? Where on one side, the narrative is this is the the party that the racists basically flocked to after they couldn't win in our own. And on the other side, it's no, those guys always were Democratic. And it seems like that those policies have kind of shifted over time in a way that very much seems like an evolution rather than a discardation. And I'll give just a brief example of that because I'm long-winded and I know that. Hillary Clinton, who was a disciple of John Byrd, I think his name's John, but he's a KKK leader, was the Democratic nominee for president in 2016. That's 6 years ago, right? Now, does she believe some of the stuff he did? Definitely not. I think that's very true. But she has been quoted saying things like, hey, we need a large population of workers that would be willing to work for less than minimum wage, speaking specifically about illegal immigrants on farms. That's kind of a racist policy, right? And it's not because she's racist. I don't think she is, but it is because she is a disciple of those Southern Democrats who came before her. On the flip side, Donald Trump, somebody who is considered by very many people to be violently racist. I don't understand why. I think you can have a lot of problems with him, but I don't think he's a racist. Got more of the black vote in 2020 than any Republican has since Nixon, which was, 1972? And so when you start looking at the policies as they pertain specifically to race, because that's, again, what the Southern strategy is and the party switch and all that is supposed to be talking about, it's really not what people like to make it out to be. There's a lot of evidence to suggest those remnants of the old Democratic Guard are still there. Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, etc. And on the flip side, those remnants of the old Democratic Guard don't really seem to pop up on the side. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, that's pretty far going, like putting Biden and Hillary as like the remnants of the Dixiecrats, I would think. Like you might have been able to, I've been waiting for you to bring up Robert Byrd. We could bring him up. But he was like the last Dixiecrat. I would say Hillary and Biden are more of I would say Hillary is just one of the ultimate classic examples we've got of corruption. She started off pretty pure from a very poor family, and I think she had some really righteous ambitions as young. And you saw as she got power, just how kind of that power corrupted her. So I think she's a unique story within herself. But I think Biden's just, he's an old moderate. Like he still considers Mitch McConnell his best friend, even though Mitch McConnell has made it his ambition to destroy his presidency, just like he did Obama. Biden still considers Mitch a good friend. That's the school of Democrat that Biden is from. But you're talking about Republican platforms have never changed. From the 1860s until the early 1900s, Republicans dominated northern states and orchestrated ambitious expansions of federal power. Lincoln himself did this during the Civil War with his executive powers during wartime. And he's really responsible for the industrialization of the North, and he's responsible for railroad tycoons and big business. And that's how Republicans became the big business party. It was vital he did this to win the war, but he still did it. And on the other side of it, Democrats ruled the South. While the lines have blurred, the farther and farther we've gotten into, this experiment of America, political philosophy has always been divided geographically, and it still pretty much remains so today, even though it's more blurred than ever today. But back then, it just wasn't. The liberal North and the conservative South. And what we have for the first 50 years of the Republican Party or so, even into that 1928 era, when you did have some presidential nominees that were conservative, this party was still mainly liberal. Politics were not as partisan back then as they are now. The flip, I know people want to make it about what happened with the Southern strategy, and that's a major part of it. I don't want to take away from that, but that's not, when it comes to history, things usually play out over a long period of time. And this really played out over about 100 years. Like I said, FDR is the one that really started to change the narrative for the Democrats, because as you said yourself, most people in the country did not trust Democrats. They just didn't. Even the Southern slave owners didn't really trust them. They were the party of slavery, so they had to go with them. They were corrupt as corrupt could be back then, in all ways, not just racially. What I'm talking about is that utilization and that slow over time flip of political philosophy to where the Republican Party just isn't that party of emancipation. When it's not that party when it comes to social justice like it was back then. And yeah, it took a long time, but we are here and we see the products of that. I don't think that you would ever admit the Republican Party is the party of social justice warriors. That would be us, right?
Well, I think that's a fair point, but I also think you'd have to point out again the ideas of social justice, have shifted in such a way that most of the people who were for it in the 50s would probably be against it now. I'm not going to go as far as to claim Martin Luther King would have voted Republican, because he had a lot of views that were not kind of socialist, but actually socialist. So he might be a Bernie Sanders supporter in the modern day, but he might not because of his very socially conservative views. It'd be interesting to see somebody like Martin Luther King in the modern day, actually, because I don't think there is a politician who has that blend of social conservatism and kind of socialist economics. But nonetheless,
we have seen that on the other side, though. Like I mentioned, Robert Byrd. Oftentimes in these conversations, he gets brought up as a Democratic member that was a member of the KKK. Dude literally got his start organizing Klan rallies in the 40s, right? But like, you know, people often bring him up, and I hate it when the lefties that are arguing won't defend him, because even though it's hard to defend his past, the man went the opposite route, right? Like he became one of the more progressive members of the Democratic Party as time went on. And in fact, he's the guy that said later in life that he would not have stood against civil rights in retrospect, like he did back in 64 and in 57 and in 60. You know, like he's a person that flipped on the other side of that and was that deeply racist person, but over time was able to change and came to a different position.
Well, and I will actually, even in a sort of olive branch sense, there is a little bit I could offer for, you know, the people who wanted to defend the Democratic Party history, and that it was certainly a complicated issue. I mean, there are two guys off the top of my head from the early 1900s, pre-20s. William David Upshaw, who was a representative from Georgia, and William Jennings Bryan, who was a representative and presidential candidate from Kansas, both very, very anti-KKK. In fact, Upshaw even walked out of a convention in the South back when he was representing Georgia back in the 1910s because he didn't want to be associated with what he considered to be a paramilitary terrorist group. And what he considered was, of course, accurate, right? That's what they were at the time. I think they've kind of calmed down as far as what they do, although they haven't calmed down as far as their rhetoric. But we haven't seen a whole lot of the brutality that was, you know, there in the 1870s to the 1920s. But I digress. You know, so I'm perfectly willing to grant that sort of a thing as far as there being contention within the Democratic Party. But I still think we're running into that same sort of a wall, right? Of where do we see the issues of racial civil rights switch, right? Because from where I'm standing, I look at some of these platforms. I think a great example, you brought up Theodore Roosevelt in your opening statement, right? And Theodore Roosevelt, actually, he even, not only was he a progressive, he even founded a party called the Progressive Party.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, yeah, he started his own, like, third party that was, like, progressive as hell.
Yeah, and we tend to remember it as the Bull Moose Party, but that was actually a nickname, right? Its actual name was the United States Progressive Party. And it's certainly true to say, well, he was a Republican, but one of the things that gets kind of lost in translation there is that he wasn't a particularly popular Republican amongst hardcore Republicans. Now, amongst the nation, certainly, he's one of those popular presidents ever, right?
Yeah, African American communities love the man. They
worshipped
him. They worshipped him.
And on top of that, we had a lot of they wouldn't be voters yet because the 1920 amendment that gave women the right to vote didn't quite pass yet. But women quite liked him. Labor unions liked him. You know, a lot of people. But let's recall in 1912, he decided the whole reason he wanted to even have a progressive party in the first place is because he decided he wanted to run against William Howard Taft because Taft was too conservative for his liking. And he, you know, remember, he passes the torch of his presidency to Taft and, you know, handpicks him his successor. Taft wins in basically a landslide. And we end up getting our 4 years of President Taft. Taft and Roosevelt have to run against each other in 1912 because Roosevelt didn't like the fact that Taft was going back to the conservative ways of being very pro-business, anti-taxation, pro-tariff, stuff like that, right? And so he ended up running against Taft in 1912 and splitting the party vote in such a way that got Woodrow Wilson elected. Now, not only does that demonstrate the conservatism that was very much present there in the early 1900s Republican Party, because they were throwing their hat behind Taft. They didn't really like Roosevelt, even though their base certainly did. But as far as the establishment and people like that who were your donors, I guess would be another way to put it. But on top of that, notice who beat the both of them. It was Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson, incredibly, I guess you could use the word conservative if you'd like. It technically would be accurate, but I don't think it's American conservatism, the ideology, as much as it is dictionary definition conservatism. But he was pro-segregation, right? He's very racist. He had basically a Klan propaganda film shown.
To be fair to most people back then, most people were damn racist. Most white folks were still under that, white supremacy umbrella from slavery. So, I try not to condemn, like, what people did back then to me is like the past, right? So, I want to look at, I consider him to be one of the worst presidents we ever had, but, I try not to let, like, the monstrous things socially get to me. I want, it's his policy, I think, that makes him a terrible president. But I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No, you're fine. But notice what some of his policies ended up being. Not all of them, of course, because I think there's a long, and I actually agree Woodrow Wilson is a terrible president. The funny thing about that is that actually tends to be a bipartisan opinion.
Yeah, it does.
But if we look at some of the things that he had done, right? So he was very progressive in regards to things like trust busting. He was very big in things like globalization, which is typically seen, at least in the modern day, is seen more as a liberal policy than a conservative policy.
But back then, I think it was considered more of a Republican. Republicans were big business, so they were all for kind of spreading the business around the world. I'd have to really look into that, but my gut is telling me that back then, I think that role was a bit reversed as well.
Well, kind of, because you got to remember that the thing about, when I say you got to remember, right, it's one of those things where it's like we're doing a debate, so obviously, I can't assume my position, but
yeah, I'm going on a gut there, yeah. So I don't, yeah.
That being said, though, the Republicans of that time were very much, kind of isolationist in a way. That they thought that, and for the record, I don't even necessarily say this as something that's bad. I'm somewhat isolationist myself. But they were very big on things like tariffs. They were very big on things like economic protectionism, which of course is related to tariffs. They were very big on the idea of having the country itself be kind of self-sufficient. I think the word there is actually autarky, which autarky tends to have a bad taste in people's mouth these days because the fascists were very big on it. But early Republicans there were very big on it as well, and non-intervention also. When it came to World War I, when it came to World War II, when it came to things like the Banana Wars, it was typically the really hardcore conservatives who were saying, look, let's just kind of stick to our own thing here. There's no reason for us to be going abroad and doing all that sort of stuff. Now, in the modern day, that tends to be a little bit more dicey. Obviously, Bush is an interventionist. Obviously, we have somebody in the form of Donald Trump who claims not to be, right?
In modern times, both parties have been infested by the Leo or the neo aspects of it, right? So you got your neo conservatives, you got your neoliberals. They all love war. War's big business.
Right?
Yeah.
100%. And we haven't had a legitimate war, in my opinion, since, I guess you could say the war on terror, we were attacked, but that still wasn't declared. So there's still, I think, some problems there.
I agree. I don't think we've had a legitimate war in a long time.
Yeah. But you kind of see what I'm saying, though, where it's like the Republicans are still the low tax party. They're still the I want to stay home rather than go abroad party. They're still the economic isolation party. Right.
Well, but that's my point, though. They've always been fiscally conservative, and there's been elements of their platform that's always been there, like that hasn't changed from the beginning. What the argument comes down to is the acceptance of the social conservatism over the liberalism of the Republican past. That's the argument, right? And I think that plays out just plainly with the eye test. I mean, you can look at the modern day and you can see that. So yeah, I mean, that's mainly the argument is it's I don't think that the Republican Party took over the KKK, right? But they definitely took over the South, and they utilized different strategies and able to do so. And it wasn't all racist, like I think part of it was utilizing racist tendencies because politicians will utilize anything they can to win. I think Democrats did it for a very long time as well. I don't want to condemn either party, but it's just when it comes to the flip, in my opinion, this has been made an issue by people on the right not liking what history says. People on the right want to make this argument to minority communities because they played that Southern strategy for so long that they're the party of Lincoln. And that's not a true statement. And I don't think that you could really disagree with that because, like I said, when it comes to the social issues, they have went conservative when the Republicans were liberal. That's the issue of the party flip. It's not like they're going to, some things stay the same. They've always been big business. Like they've always been big business. Now they used to be big government. They're small government now, or at least they say they're still like we just brought up, interventionists. So, while they talk small government, they believe in the biggest military in the world, right? Which is big government. But I digress. The whole point of the argument is not like I don't want to be one of these people coming on here arguing that, hey, it's just racist, because that's not what history says. But history does indeed say that there was this geographical flip to where the Democrats used to be those Southern conservatives, and they're not anymore. And it was a lot of various different issues. It began with FDR, the after effects of the Great Depression, when everybody was hit economically, no matter what level of wealth you had, you was hit, to civil rights. But then the ultimate motivating factor, and I agree with you on this, like you kind of brought this up as well, was Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade was where the Republican Party was able to nail that evangelical vote. And that was the vote that was critical for winning the South. If you want, you called it the Bible Belt several times here. If you want to win the South, you got to get that vote. So to me, Roe v. Wade is the overlying factor, but you can't ignore all of the civil rights issues that led up to that moment when Roe v. Wade came. I don't even think most people thought it was going to be that controversial at the time because abortion had been legal before, but the evangelical lobby made it their issue, and then the Republican Party made it their issue.
Well, see, to me, that now, granted, this is in a way,
and take your time. I gotta go and fill up my soda glass. I'll be right back.
Yeah, absolutely. In a way, that almost sounds to me like a concession. Now, of course, you've said to me that some of the things I've said sounds like a concession. So in a way, this is just part of the nature of hammering down these debates. I do think that this is something that is very important to note when we start looking at what the actual kind of claims are, because when I listen to somebody like Shapiro, Carlson, even D'Souza, who I think D'Souza is probably, in regards to this issue, a little bit more on the right side of things, right meaning right left spectrum, not right wrong spectrum, but nonetheless, what you just said is precisely the argument that they make. The South is not dominated by conservatives because of racism or segregation or anything like that. The South is dominated by conservatives because Roe v. Wade, issues of what we would consider moral issues like divorce, homosexuality, things of that nature, and issues that are pertaining to I don't know exactly what the word would be here, but basically just more religious type issues, right? I think Republicans have kind of positioned themselves recently as the party of religious freedom. They certainly have positioned themselves as the party of things like school prayer or creation in schools or things like that, right? And that really seems to be the way that the South ended up coming over to the Republican side. It doesn't seem to have much to do with issues of racism.
It was one of the major factors, but you can't take away the issues of racism either. Now, if Republicans, if you could sit here and provide legitimate evidence that, I recently granted on my stream earlier today, it's the first time I've ever done so publicly, that I've come to the conclusion that Russiagate was quote unquote fake news, right? It took me a long time to get there, but I finally came to that. If the Southern strategy wasn't never implemented, then you could take away any racism from there. But they definitely implemented the Southern strategy. And then, like I've said, they implemented it in several different ways, right? Over time, racism became less of a big deal. It's still a huge deal. I see Udhef in the side chat mentioning it, and I can tell you, like, I haven't been down in the South in a while, but when I was down there, Confederate flags were still everywhere. The South will rise again was a popular term, right? And the South will rise again means one thing: slavery. That's what they're talking about, right? So,
well, those
elements of racism are still there. Like I'm telling you, as a guy that grew up in the Southern Belt, when a white man from the South tells you the South will rise again, they are talking about slavery. At least they were 20 years ago when I lived down there.
See, and I'm not even going to necessarily deny that, because I'm supremely confident that racism is probably a bigger problem in the Bible Belt than anywhere else in the country.
And I think it's actually spread throughout the country fairly significantly. Like I've said, I've pointed it out in several streams, but I said it in this debate as well. Here in modern times, those old Southern Confederates can be found everywhere now. I see the rebel flag everywhere up here now.
That's kind of the issue. I think there is not quite as simple as that, though, because you got to understand that when it comes to issues of the rebel flag and Confederate statues, this issue has evolved into, I think, something that is much different than what some other people might suggest. Now, there are still groups like, for example, the League of the South, right? League of the South is a group headed by Dr. Michael Hill, and their stated goal is to have a nation in the former Confederacy for the, quote, Southern people, by which they mean Anglo-Saxon descended white folk. And that's a very clear thing in their platform. It wasn't always that way. They were originally a Southern independence group for the entire South, but they ended up kind of pushing out people who were not racist and not anti-Semitic and things like that in favor of people who were more like Michael Hill himself. I think Tom Woods has recently had to answer for the fact that he was one of the founding members of that League of the South, and he's maintained the consistent defense that does seem to be backed up by history, which is originally it was Southern nationalist, but it wasn't the kind of racist elements that we see today. And there's numerous reasons that go into the different nationalist movements throughout the country, like Texas nationalism, Hawaii nationalism, and stuff like that. But when speaking specifically about issues of the Confederate flag, right? I know, and I don't know anybody who's from the Deep South in my personal life, right? Everybody I know, I mean, I'm in Idaho. Most of the people here, if they're not from Idaho, they're from other places on the West Coast, right? Utah, Colorado, California, Washington, Nevada, etc. And I know tons of people who would fly a Confederate flag. I myself have a symbolic meaning behind the Confederate flag. And most of the people I know who do that aren't actually even white people. A lot of them are black people who have no familial relation to the South whatsoever. And there is a specific reason for that, right? The reason is a lot of us see that as essentially a symbol now, not of the Southern Confederacy itself, but of the preservation of history, which we feel like is under attack, right? And that goes for people all across racial divides. It doesn't necessarily go across political divides. I will give you that. This is a primarily conservative thing. But you'll see Ben Carsons of the world and people like that putting the same meaning behind the Confederate flag that I would, which is, hey, I feel like we're trying to basically destroy American history in a way that seems super cultural revolution-y, meaning the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And I don't like that. In fact, it really worries me. And for evidence of this, when we had the protest over 2020, where, people were doing all the different stuff they were doing all across the country, a lot of the things that were attacked weren't just Confederate flags and statues of Robert E. Lee, right? We also had people going after Theodore Roosevelt statues. We had people going after memorials to the 54th Massachusetts, which was a 100% black regiment of soldiers. People were going after the Lincoln Monument. People were saying, hey, we need to no longer have George Washington as the name of a school and stuff like that, right? And so while on the surface, that could seem like something where it's like, hey, this is a racial issue that Republicans are supporting now, right? I don't think it's really that simple. I think this is more of an issue of there are a lot of people who genuinely see that flag as a symbol of the preservation of history proper, and not just as a symbol of the keeping down of a certain group of people. Although I admit that your Dr. Michael Hills do exist. Those people are out there, but they tend to fly a different flag these days. They tend to fly that white flag with the black St. Andrew's cross on it, which is the Southern nationalist flag. They don't tend to fly that Confederate battle flag anymore. I almost think that's an implicit acceptance on their part of exactly what I'm talking about, which is these symbols have changed their meaning over time.
Well, yeah. So when it comes to like Confederate statues, we've had that debate. I think it's an important movement, but I don't want to erase history. I just don't want them to be in public. I want to have like, I want them to be preserved for history, put in a museum, have this huge national museum on the Civil War and slavery and civil rights in this country, and some kind of program to make it for every American, make it easy for every American to get there at least once in their life, right? I don't know, but a lot of activists go overboard, and yeah, I saw, while I support, like defaming legendary heroes like Christopher Columbus because he was a monster. I think some people do go overboard and they start to take it to the Washingtons of the world. I can't think of any reason why anybody would want to go after Theodore Roosevelt, but I'd have to look at why people would go after that. Like, and the destruction of the statues, even though I've admitted I participated back in my young activism days, way back in the day, in the destruction of a statue in Chapel Hill. I don't necessarily tend to agree with that. I want a preservation of the statues, and I want to do it the political way, going through the local and state legislatures to get the monuments taken down, and then going federally for some kind of federal museum where we're actually dedicating ourselves to remembering the history accurately. I'm all for that, but I think activists on both sides go overboard when it comes to a lot of things on that issue. But like you spoke of, like, the secession there for a moment, and I kind of recall you yourself being willing or even calling for like a secession to where like there could be two countries, a conservative country and a liberal country. Is that something that you would stand behind?
So you're right, and also not. I am an advocate of national divorce quite openly at this point. I would split the country in about 7 to 8 different lines.
Well, all right. So, but real quick, and I'll let you finish. But that goes to my point of this flip in the Republican Party, because we have to remember the Republican Party is the party that fought against that, right? They fought a whole war against secession.
Well, actually, though, that's a good point. But counterpoint, the national divorce issue is a kind of a bipartisan issue. And it's only amongst the extreme fringes, which I
with
freely
them damn California. The Californians make it bipartisan. It's stupid.
Well, California, but also because there's a couple others, and don't get me wrong, I hear what you're saying.
Like,
right?
Texas is the only state, as far as I know, that can actually, under the Constitution, do it. I think I'm right about that.
It's dicey. Their Constitution says they can. They
their Constitution,
yeah. But as far as the U.S. one, it's a lot more complicated. And actually, there's a Supreme Court ruling in 1867 that says they can't. But Supreme Court rulings can be changed. But here's the point with that one, though, right? And this is actually why I have more of a 7 to 8 fold idea when it comes to this. Perhaps this is a debate we could have in the future. But just to be brief with it, California, Hawaii, and also Puerto Rico are areas where the primary support behind secession is actually a lot of liberal people. In the case of Hawaii, it's more of a nativist kind of thing. And I'm actually freely in support of that. I think that Hawaii should be a country.
I actually am too. When it comes to Hawaii, I think that they should they should have their own thing.
Yeah, and I mean, it was the overthrow of a monarchy that I think that was that was illegal, frankly. I think it should belong to the Native Hawaiian people. I said Native American earlier, but Native Hawaiian people. But in regards to some of these issues, I'm supportive of most nationalist groups here because I think the experiment has run its course. And I love the United States of America. In a way, it's funny because if I were elected, which obviously I'm not running for anything, right? But a hypothetical world where CJ is a senator or something like that, I would want to preserve what we have here. But in a sort of political philosophy sense, I almost think it's just run its course. And so my full disclosure kind of idea is I think there should be independence in Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Alaska, I think would probably be good to be independent, but I think there could be a specific deal there worked out where specifically there was kind of a Native American Zionism thing going on where they actually had a country and weren't subject to the whims of a conqueror. California, Texas, and then from there, I think you could probably split relatively regionally, although I personally think everything from Idaho to Florida, that whole Midwest and South area, would probably agree to be one and the same, and then you'd probably have the Rust Belt and New England as their own sort of idea. But most of the groups that I just talked about are in many ways bipartisan. For the Republic of Lakota, for example, when it comes to Native American nation, if anything, they're more libertarian. They're not really part of either or. California and Puerto Rico, on the other hand, very social democratic, very fiscally democratic. The groups in California, not Puerto Rico. The groups in California are outright socialistic.
Well, and I don't deny that. For me, I'm like certain instances. I think it's a really good idea. I think, I'm for making Cuba a state. I believe I'd have to. I'm pretty sure that's my position.
Puerto Rico.
Or Puerto Rico. Yeah, I'm thinking of Puerto Rico. Cuba. Yeah, that's something I've been actually. I've been watching this documentary, Cuba Libre, on Netflix, so I'm kind of catching up with the history of Cuba. I was thinking of Puerto Rico. I think Puerto Rico should be a state. When it comes to like an indigenous nation, I definitely think that that's long overdue. I think that should be a bipartisan issue. I think both parties should be. We got to do something there, but I've spoken on those issues many times. But like my overall just point of the argument, though, is that the Republican philosophy at its core was staunchly against any form of secession. It was in keeping a strong union, right? And that's just another example of the political and philosophical shifts of the Republican Party. But that applies to everything because they were for keeping that union whole, mainly for a social justice issue, which was slavery at the time. So that's the point. And my ultimate point is this, and hopefully, me not coming in and just giving you the liberal propaganda on this argument would really hopefully open your eyes a little bit, but as well as some other people. I'm not perfect here. I'm sure my arguments are flawed, but I really tried to look at the overall history, and I didn't want to just delegate it and point the finger and, oh, you bad because now you the party of the KKK. I think a lot of Republicans think that that's what we mean when we say that, but honestly, it was a lot of different things. And I definitely don't want to get it twisted because while I think Roe v. Wade was a very vital thing, I think it was the nail in the coffin that really hammered home that evangelical vote. That strategy was very successful. It did turn staunchly blue Bible Belt states into swing states for a period of 20 years. And like I spoke of, that Republican Revolution of 1994, that's well documented in history as the moment when Congress went to the South, right? So, like Republicans talk about that like with nostalgia when they speak of the 94 revolution, right? So, it's history, right? And I think that I'm fully in agreement with you that while racism definitely still exists, it's nothing like it used to be, right? And there are different issues, but it still plays a role. And this is a role that's being played in immigration politics. Now there's propaganda and demonizations on both sides of that political argument there. And I think it's time that both sides start seeing through their own propaganda, just seeing the truth of things. And then maybe we can start working things out. I know that's a different route than I've taken in the past, but I'm trying to change things up now.
Well, and to be fair, I actually do appreciate a lot about the opening statement that you had here, and then even some of the back and forth here also, right? I mean, this has been I think a good conversation.
Well, I usually like my convos with you, man. Even though we disagree, 99.9% of the time it's cordial and we can get along doing it.
Yeah, I think that's true, and actually, I think that helps when it comes to some of the more, shall we say, robustly offensive topics like biblical slavery or Confederate statues, because if you have people who are willing to to kind of yell at each other for a minute and then kind of bury the hatchet after. I think it helps with those kinds of conversations.
Definitely helps. And those are the conversations I like to have. The Confederate statue, that's one where my position has probably slightly changed since the last time we had a debate on it, because I have started to see some of the harms the activism does. And I think a lot of times when the activists go overboard, then for one, right-wing media is looking at it and they're waiting to highlight those events. And once those events are highlighted, then it goes a long way into really damaging the cause that you're beginning with there. So I think that you'd probably be surprised, because my view on the Confederate statues have been a bit more moderate. Like, I still want them down, but I'm definitely against destruction. I think that that's the wrong way to go.
Well, I think that's definitely a good thing. Now, real quick though, because that's there's a portion of that which is definitely relevant for our point here, and not so much the statues itself, although that is part of it. But when it comes to the flag, right? We had talked earlier about the flag is basically universally flown by people who would vote right wing these days. And I wouldn't even deny that. I think that's true. But as I had pointed out earlier, I don't think that flag represents the Confederacy in the modern day. I think, if anything, that the white flag with the black St. Andrew's cross is really more of a racist representative flag.
Well, I definitely agree with you. Outside of the Bible Belt, no, I haven't been down in North Carolina in like 20 years. But the North Carolina I grew up in, they saw that Confederate flag for what it was. And like I said, I grew up with a Confederate flag on my wall in my bedroom that literally said "The South will rise again" on the flag, right? It had the Confederate flag, and then through the middle it had the words "The South will rise again." But I've argued with a lot of Northerners who will say, well, that's just heritage. It's states' rights and all of this stuff. And a lot of white folks, I'm not going to lie, I think that's their excuse not to be racist when you ask them about that. Because I want to think that most people just aren't that dumb, and they don't know the history behind that flag. They don't know that it was a battle standard that Lee took into battle. A flag that the Democratic KKK adopted and utilized in its reign of terror in the early 1900s. So, I want to believe that, but and I think that there's a lot of people out there that do believe that. Well, I just think a lot of them, when you ask them about it, that's what you get. Well, it just represents, Southern heritage. It represents states' rights, and I think that's a bunch of hogwash. I think that they know what it really represents, because it really represents slavery. Well, it represents the struggle to make slaves free.
Yeah, I think that it's more of a shift.
The man that made the flag laid it the dude that literally made that flag laid out what it means, and it's deeply racist. So while I think that there's white folk out there that really think that, I think most of them say that they don't really think it. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I think that's probably true for some. I won't deny that. But I do think that the issue is really more of a shift in meanings. And so I'll give a couple examples for people in regards to this, and then I'll give a couple examples for other things that I think have done a similar thing throughout history, because I think it would help to amplify, right? And the way it becomes incredibly relevant here then is kind of showing how, when it comes to certain things because really, there's only, if we wanted to get to actual racist policies, I think the only things that we could have a conversation about as far as the Republicans leaving the civil rights stuff is Confederate flags, and then also states' rights. People would say immigration, but the Republican Party's platform on immigration has been super inconsistent over the last 160 years. So, sometimes they're super pro-immigration, like in the 1960s and 50s. Sometimes they're not really big on immigration, like in the 1920s. Sometimes 80s they go back, then 2000s they go back, and you know what I mean, and so on and so forth. But with those other issues, I think that there is good conversation to be had as far as, has the Republican Party adopted some of that more racist rhetoric? I obviously don't agree that they have, but I think that it's obvious that they have taken on a lot of states' rights stuff and a lot of stuff with Confederate imagery. But now, when it comes to the Confederate imagery, specifically the battle flag, right? In in my experience, tends to be two main groups who have been flying it. And when you have the racist groups, they tend to be using other symbols, kind of tacitly moving away from that Confederate battle flag. So the first group of people is the group that you kind of pointed out, which is people who see it as a form of Southern heritage. This is not the first time that kind of thing has occurred. I think a perfect example of this is the Ethiopian flag. The Ethiopian flag is the Rasta colors, right? That green, yellow, red. It's got a little lion in it. It doesn't anymore because they got rid of the lion as a symbol of the monarchy. But, it did at the time that it was adopted as a symbol have the lion with his crown on and the cross thing and all. It's a really cool flag, actually. That has evolved now to be a symbol of African-American heritage, even though virtually no African-Americans are descendant of Ethiopians, almost none, and a symbol of stoner culture, right? Because of as well as a symbol of the religion of Rastafarianism, which actually is the catalyst for it becoming both of those things, because Rastafarianism is very big on Black nationalism, and they're also very big on smoking pot. As a result, that flag has evolved to have two meanings, neither of which is the national standard of the monarchy of Ethiopia or of the country of Ethiopia, right? I think you have a similar thing that goes on here with the Confederate battle flag. The Confederate battle flag certainly was a symbol of the nation of the Confederacy, although even still, that's still an evolution because originally it was a symbol of the armies of the Confederacy, whereas their actual national flag is the stars and bars, right? But nonetheless, it did become a symbol of the Confederate idea and all that. But it's evolved now to be, I think, a symbol of the people there who consider it a heritage flag. And then also people like myself who would consider that to be a symbol of national preservation and historical preservation. And again, this, not only would you have the Ethiopian flag, and I'll stop here after this, but there's another example of this that I think is very pertinent to the conversation, which is I forget exactly what they call it, but it's that black, red, and green flag that is meant to represent African-American civil rights. That originally started out not as anything for African-American civil rights, but as a flag that was going to be for the new Africa, which was the Nation of Islam's idea of having a nation of only Black Americans in the South. It was a strictly racist, racial supremacist, racial separationist kind of flag. And nowadays, it's a symbol of the of basically just being a Black American, right? And so I think these symbols do change over time, and as a result, those who support them do end up changing over time as well.
I would say that historically some symbols can. I just don't think that this one has. I haven't seen any evidence of it. I just don't. Now I will say that you're more extremist racists definitely needed their own colors, if you want to call them that, because the rebel flag was adopted nationally and has spread nationally. And it's like with anything when it comes to human beings. Once you tell people that something's bad, like they started to do with the Confederate flag in my 20s, I believe it was, when people really started coming down on it, that you're just going to make people more interested in it. And I think it's also not necessarily fully racist, although I do think most people have these racist tendencies. They have to know what it stands for, what it stood for, what it has always stood for. But I think it also has become this thing that Republicans do when it comes to the social justice liberals, and that is pretty much F you, let's be as offensive as we can, right? So you think I'm a racist, I'm just going to fly this flag and let you think what you're going to think. Well, it's not just letting me think what I'm going to think. It's also flying that flag and letting all of those minority groups that flag affected think what they think. And it gives us room to judge you based upon that. So, even for those folks that are using it just to be offensive or whatever, or to push it back at the liberals, well, now you've given us a basis to judge you even further. And I will judge you based upon that, because I cannot sit here and think that you're that ignorant, not you specifically, but the people flying the flag, that you're that ignorant not to realize what it represents, or that you know, as ancient history as you might want to make believe it is, slavery didn't end that long ago, and Jim Crow definitely didn't end that long ago. And people are still feeling that, and we still see social injustice. And you know, while symbols might change, I would maintain that some symbols, it's going to take a really long time for the meanings behind those symbols to change. You know, we're not going to just automatically forget what the Nazi symbol stood for just because some people wanted to save their German history. We understand what that symbol means, and we understand it with the rebel flag as well.
Well, you know, actually, that's an interesting one in itself, just because the Nazis basically robbed the swastika.
Well, yeah, it was an old ancient symbol from way back in the day.
Yeah, but we won't get into that because that'll derail the conversation. But you know, and this could be a debate in and of itself, certainly. So I don't want to, you know, bog it down too much.
We could go for it. I am very passionate about the rebel flag.
Well, and it's funny because in a way I am too, right? But obviously we're coming from very different perspectives, right? In the case that I think we have a serious threat to not just our own history, but history in general.
And we didn't really divulge from the original topic because this is all of that. You know, honestly, you know, the rebel flag comes into play in that Southern strategy, right? The utilizing of these symbols and this culture, making it mainstream, making it more accessible for people all across the country to boast their numbers. That's all a part of that Southern strategy.
But so what my sort of last point with this will be, because then we're probably almost out of time, and I want to talk a little bit about the states' rights thing too.
Yeah, I got to cook dinner.
So we have the view that this is, again, kind of seen as like a historical preservation. It's not the only one that has adopted that sort of view. I don't think people see the Betsy Ross flag as an American flag anymore, as much as they do a flag about historical preservation. And it does appear that switch is, if not gotten completely underway, has almost gotten completely underway. But I think the reason that I wanted to use the examples of those different Black nationalism flags, right? Specifically and in fact, I'll show a picture so that people know what I'm talking about, because if I just keep saying it, you may not actually have a good idea of what's being discussed, right? But this one right here, right? I think we've all probably seen this, especially in the modern day. It's the red, black, and green flag that people use to kind of say, you know, hey, this is for our, you know, for I guess Black rights. In most people's case, I think some people still use it as a Black Power flag, but probably not many. But that's originally what it was, right? It was a flag by Marcus Garvey, who was a Black nationalist. It was adopted by the Nation of Islam, who wanted to establish a exclusively segregated Black nation. But over time, it became something that was more just hey, I'm an African American here in the United States, and this is like a symbol of me, right? And I think that's a similar thing that you have going on here with this Confederate flag. The Confederate flag certainly was a symbol that was adopted by racism, but it also is a symbol that was adopted by people who really want to see preservation of history and a symbol of people who identify with a certain geographical location.
Well, so but the people that so-called are worried about a preservation of history are the very ones that don't want us to teach that history in classrooms.
Well, I don't know about that. I think that I'll grant you that can be a 50-50 kind of thing, because certainly with some that's true. That's actually the timer right there. But I'll say, like, for myself, and I'll let you respond to this after, because I don't want to jump on the last word. But I'll say for myself, I am down with the honoring of Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee, as well as the honoring of Nat Turner and John Brown. I think we should celebrate Juneteenth, and I also think that there's nothing wrong with the Jackson Lee Day. You know what I mean?
You say honoring, though, and remembering history is one thing. Honoring people is quite another. And I don't think anybody should be in my opinion, should be honoring Robert E. Lee, who chose to turn away from his country and fight for Virginia so he can keep slavery. I know everybody wants to make out Robert E. Lee as like the best slave master everywhere until you go and look at the words of his slaves. I I want to remember history, but I want to remember it accurately, and I do not want to honor any of those folk, whether they be Democrat or Republican. I don't care who they were. I don't want to honor any of them.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a conversation for another time, only because it does get into a new topic.
And we're at the end. We're at the end.
Yeah. But the only reason I bring it up, though, is just to say that I think that can vary, right? You can have a lot of people who are really looking at history through the lens of wanting a sort of honor and preservation of it, and then you can also have people who want to put forward a narrative. I won't deny that at all. That's part of the reason I talked to my brother Phil Fox, because he points out a lot of the stuff from a Native American perspective that well, it's less than savory. We'll leave it there.
Yeah, the native story is it's less than savory for sure. Yeah.
With that said, though, that is the conclusion of our open time. We actually went probably about a minute over, but that's perfectly fine. So what we're gonna go ahead and do now, I only got 3 questions, which are fine. Actually, I wasn't expecting any. If anybody else has questions, tag me at the Synagogue News right now. This is your last chance. But nonetheless, we're going to go ahead and get into our 5-minute finishing statements, and then we'll answer these questions and move on there. And yeah, if anybody has any final questions, just make sure you get them in now, because we're just about done with this. Knock, you have 5 minutes on your first word.
All right, cool. So yeah, like my position is, the party flip happened, but it doesn't make Republicans racist today. It doesn't make them anything. It just means that political philosophies, political parties changed geographical locations. And if you look at the political map of the common day, it really reflects that Republicans have done well in smaller communities, and Democrats have done well in consolidated larger communities throughout the progression of time. Liberalism pretty much lives in the big city now. Conservatism pretty much lives in the country. That's where we're at today. But the political shift happened. I don't think it necessarily means anything other than this is historically what happened. And it's good to draw knowledge from that and understand who you're talking to and how things do tend to flip. You mentioned that in 2020, Donald Trump brought in the biggest gains of the African-American vote Republicans have seen in quite a long time. That's true, because pendulums do shift, and we're seeing a shift, and we're seeing movements like Brexit. As much as I disagree with Candace Owens' facts, she was very effective in reaching Black communities. I talk to Black folk all the time that have been affected by the propaganda of Brexit. It's maddening, but it's reality, and I don't want to run away from reality. And I would hope, I had these debates that the other side will join me in that. Let's look at reality, right? So I'm not going to sit here and point the racist finger, but I am going to say that the party shift happened, and the results of it is the political landscape we live in today. And honestly, the political turmoil we live in today. Right now, we live in a lot of political turmoil, whether you want to talk about Trump being the leader of the Republican Party, whether you want to talk about the Democratic Party and how they're really unwilling to break away from their big corporate agenda. The political landscape today is pretty much screwed for anybody that looks at it logically. And I think until we start looking at it logically, get out of this partisanship that we're all in, we're never going to solve anything. And if anything, we're just going to start killing each other. And I don't want to see that happen. So, yeah, I want to have these conversations. I enjoy them. I definitely think that the party shift happened. I definitely think that people on both sides spew a lot of nonsense when they talk about it. So I just wanted to talk about history. So hopefully I did that today. I'll definitely watch it back and see how I did. So thank you. That's all I got.
All righty. That's the silly layout there. I'll go ahead and put another 5 minutes here on the clock. And let's go ahead and jump into this. All right. So I want to thank everybody who has been here, including Knock. This is actually a very good conversation. I very much enjoyed this debate. It's not always that we do get enjoyable debates, although usually, I don't mean we as in me and Knock, I mean we as in us as a group.
I think we've only had one bad one where I got pretty pissed. So.
Yeah, for the most part, they all have been pretty good, actually. So that is fairly true. I want to go ahead and end this in the sort of typical ways that I end these. So let's go ahead and do that. First way, I know this wasn't a religious debate, but I think these words from the book of Proverbs are useful for any conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and quote Proverbs 27:2. Let someone else praise you and not your own mouth, an outsider and not your own lips. If you guys thought that there was good information put forward here today, if you thought that this was edifying, if it was something that was educational for you, if it made it anything more clear, anything like that, please let me know yourself. Any constructive criticisms there are certainly approved and appreciated. The same chapter of the book of Proverbs in verse 17 says, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. If you guys felt that I did a poor job here today, that I was, running away from the facts, or that I was somehow not putting forward the facts in a coherent manner, whatever it happens to be, again, constructive criticism of that kind is certainly appreciated. I know this wasn't a religious debate, but I think those words of Proverbs are definitely relevant for any conversations that we get in, and really for anything that we do, right? It's good for your praises to come from without, and it's good for you to be taking criticism when it's necessary. The point of these conversations, as much as I want to make this a career and be good at debating and all that kind of stuff, the point of these conversations is to get greater edification for everybody, is to get greater education for everybody, is to come to an honest pursuit of truth. And so before anything else, after anything else, during everything else, that needs to be the goal. Now, with that said, I want to go ahead and draw together what I see as the conclusions here of this debate. I recognize that those of you who felt like I didn't do a very good job or who came on the opposite side would probably disagree, but nonetheless, this is what I feel as if has been established here. Number one, we can agree that there was a demographic shift in the American South. The American South used to be primarily voting for the blue. Today, it is primarily voting for the red. Number two, this shift was not done on the issues of segregation or civil rights for African Americans or other racial groups, but rather seems to be more of a shift in social policy, specifically in regards to things like divorce, homosexual marriage, abortion, and etc. And number three, that some of the issues that we do actually see as the main platform issues of either party have been the main platform issues of either party for over 100 years. I pointed out this in regards to things like tariffs, economic protectionism, isolationism, pro-business policy, low taxes, things of that nature. For the most part, if we go from the 1912 election, the 1928 election, the 1932 election, the 1960 election, so on and so forth, we're going to see that it is basically the same as far as those policies, which are the main platform policies we've seen. There has been shift as far as issues being discussed, and so certain issues have been done away with as far as party platforms are concerned, while others have been added. But in regards to the core issues, I think they have been primarily the same ideology, same philosophy. And lastly, I think the last thing that we saw is that there is a significant amount of complication in the few things that we can say have potentially shifted, namely things like Confederate imagery and states' rights. We weren't able to get too much into states' rights, but my position, to reiterate from my opening statement, is basically that the states' rights issue is super inconsistent. Liberals are down with states' rights when it comes to things like smoking pot, see Washington and Colorado, and conservatives are very down with states' rights when it comes to things like evolution in schools, and neither one seems to be particularly down with states' rights when it comes to the other's use of states' rights. So I don't know that you can actually pin the support of states' rights on either group, although it certainly is found in the 9th and 10th Amendments. So perhaps we should both kind of collectively agree on issues of states' rights. I digress on that. I think this was a very good conversation. We don't have very much questions, so we're going to go ahead and get into those. I'm done with my time here, and looks like neither one of us ended up taking up the full 5 minutes. But nonetheless.
Yeah, I never prepare my closings. So.
Yeah, I don't either. So I think that's probably a good idea too, because a lot of times you don't necessarily know where the conversation is going to go. All right, so the first question that we have, let me get to my private chat because I posted them in the private chat. The first question that we have, and I'm going to post them in the live chat also so that we can get them on the screen. Anybody else who has questions, this is your last call for questions, but nonetheless. This one's for me. You'll have a chance to respond after. It says, if Republicans didn't utilize the Southern strategy, then why did the chief of the RNC apologize on behalf of the GOP for utilizing the Southern strategy? And I think this came from Udhef. So I think there's a couple things to be pointed out there. The first thing is, I think a lot of people apologize for a lot of things all of the time, and it literally means absolutely nothing. Not to say that that's the only answer here, because I want to address your question more specifically, but politicians saying stuff is just, it's as old as the prostitution profession. You know what I mean? It just happens. I'll give a perfect example of that. Ted Cruz has on one end of his mouth spoken about January 6th was a terrible attack on democracy, and on another end of his mouth has said January 6th was completely overblown and is being used by the Biden administration to silence political critics. The difference is the crowd he was talking to. So, when it comes to this sort of thing, people apologize for stuff all the time that they don't really mean. I would not be surprised to see plenty of Republican politicians saying this, that, and the third about where they were in the past because they feel like it gets them political brownie points. With that being said, though, in regards to the Southern strategy itself, I don't necessarily think the Southern strategy is 100% wrong. In a way, and what I mean by that is I do believe that there is a effect that ended up being kind of like a Southern strategy from issues like, for example, 1964, Barry Goldwater running. He was very much against the Civil Rights Act. He had deep ideological reasons for that, but he was very much against it. He thought that it was an example of the federal government stepping on people's rights as well as stepping on issues of states' rights. And then that, of course, would lead to some people in the South saying, oh, yeah, that's obviously something we can use to continue on with our, racism and stuff like that. So I do think there is an element of truth to the Southern strategy. I don't think that what Lee Atwater said about it being a strategy specifically to try and get white voters in, I don't think that was true. I think Lee Atwater's kind of full of crap, if I'm being honest with you. But I do think, I do recognize that there are issues which led some to, use them to their advantage, I guess. And go ahead and take as long as you need for your own answer.
Well, I tend to agree. I think Atwater's ridiculous on most things, but I don't think that people, especially politicians, are going to attach themselves to something that's become negative unless they see a political benefit to it, and that is like, hey, I'm going to be the truthful one now. But Lee Atwood, he wasn't the only one. Like I said, I think his name was Phillips, the Republican strategist that from the Nixon campaign, who first voiced it in that New York Times article. We've had like the question itself says the chief of the RNC apologize. Yeah, that could be political. We've also had Mitch McConnell recognize that that's something that they utilize. And I think you can also see when, very plainly, if you look at history, when they really stopped utilizing it and really started to try to open the umbrella to more minority groups. A lot of people, you can look at immigration policy, while a lot of Latin American folks don't like a lot of Republican policies. When it comes to immigration policy, a lot of them like that. A lot of them have pride in how they got citizenship, and they want people to have to go through that process. So, I think you can definitely see where Republicans started to go away from that strategy while still utilizing it in certain campaigns. Democrats utilize it sometimes in certain campaigns. You'll get the dog whistling from Democrats sometimes if they think that their demographics going to pick up on it. Politicians are going to utilize anything at their disposal to win elections. I think we both agree upon that.
All right, thank you for that. And the next thing we'll have here is question from Jill. This one's for you, so you'll answer first. He asks, come on, there we go. Is the assumption that because blacks voted for Democrats, that's proof of a Southern strategy or switch? And which one of Nixon's campaign slogans suggests a racist or Southern strategy?
All right, so I kind of addressed this because I did see it in the chat during the debate. It's like I didn't really talk about Nixon that much. I didn't want to point a finger at Nixon. I think, I think Nixon was a racist, but I think that his policy wasn't necessarily. We only like the a lot of the tapes got released, the Watergate tapes. A lot of information has been released about how Nixon was behind the scenes. Everybody's heard the thing about, putting marijuana on the narcotics classification in order to lock up those hippies and those black people. So like we know that he was a racist, but like I tend to agree with CJ when it came to policy. I don't think you can really put that on him, at least when he was president. So I didn't really talk about Nixon. The assumptions that because blacks voted for Democrats, proof of a Southern strategy. No, the first time, like I mentioned in my opening, the first time the black vote voted Democrat was for FDR. And it was because economically, for the first time, they didn't go with the Emancipation Party. They went with the person that they thought was going to help them economically right after the Great Depression, when pretty much everybody went for FDR because of the Great Depression. So you saw other instances where, Democrats would get higher percentages of the black vote, but that really wasn't it didn't really become an issue until after Brown versus the School Board of Education. Democrats had made it their platform in the 50s to expand civil rights, but you still had those Southern Democrats fighting it. So politics is a mixed bag, as well as history. And there's always nuance to everything when it comes to American history. And that's the thing that I think that frightens me the most, because while CJ talks about preserving history when it comes to statues, I think that there's a lot of whitewashing of American history. We want to fantasize what America should be, not what it always has been. So I'm all for history, real history, accurate history. I think people should know it. And Jill's question, I just think, is trolling a little bit, honestly, because I really didn't talk about Nixon at all. I know a lot of liberals do in this conversation, but I didn't.
Yeah, and what I'll add there, the first thing I want to add is just to say about your concern about whitewashing American history. I freely agree to that, actually. To give a couple examples, I do. I mean, I don't celebrate Juneteenth because I'm not descendant of black people. It'd be kind of weird.
I did see your post on that. I appreciated that post. I thought it was great.
Well, thank you. And it's one of those things where it's like, if somebody doesn't want to celebrate it, fine. But I do think certainly it's like, I would be 1,000% positive having the views I have now. If I were an African-American, or if I hung out with a lot of African-Americans, I would be celebrating Juneteenth yearly. And I think it would have been well before Biden had done anything about it, because that's just the nature of the family I grew up in. We were very traditional. We were very big on things like history. And I think it's a kind of a beautiful holiday. Also, I think we should more properly term the Native American Wars as the Native American Holocaust. That's what it was. So I don't think there's any reason for us to sugarcoat that. And a lot of other things to say about that too. I
appreciate that too. That's awesome. Because I get a lot of pushback when I say things like that. So it's nice to hear you say that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a real threat to understanding of history, is people whitewashing it. So I'm obviously, you guys know, I'm very much a lover of the founders. I've said multiple times that I have a certain level of honor around the Confederate flag and stuff like that, but that does go both ways, at least in my case. I also have a huge deal of support for the Native Americans and their struggle. I think we've invaded multiple countries illegally. The slavery issue is obviously something that is quite detestable in our history, and so on and so forth. And we need to know about those sorts of things. Now, more to the question. I think that is probably, there's a level of truth in this question for some more, popular kind of liberals, right? Cenk Youngers and people like that. I don't think the Rage actually, though, had said anything that would lead me to suggest that this question would apply to him. So, for for the most part, I think we both actually have an agreement on Nixon. Nixon was clearly in his personal life a racist and an anti-Semite, although it's weird because Henry Kissinger was one of his closest confidants and he's a Jew. But anyways, but in his actual...
That is a weird thing about like racist and anti-Semites is they sometimes they can have those people in them lives and in their lives and love and respect them and still hold the position. It's an oddity that I've found in dealing with those folks, like I have throughout the years. It blows me away every time. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen.
Yeah, for sure. And it is super bizarre when it does. Now, grant, but as far as policy is concerned, he was, very pro civil rights, anti-segregation. He was pro state of Israel, which, in regards to that anti-Semitism. So, there is a separation one needs to have between Nixon's personal life and his I
agree. I think people go overboard. You can demonize Nixon for Watergate. He's guilty. But to take away, like the dude did some good shit as president. Like, you mentioned China. I believe he was the first president to ever go to China. Like, yep. The dude did some good things. So to take that away from him, like, it's a whitewashing of history. I don't like it.
Yeah, certainly. And I think we largely would agree on that. So next question we have here, by the way, we've moved up to a total of 5. So not too much still, but nonetheless, this will be our 3rd question. So this is one for me, and I think this was also from Udhef. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. At any rate, he says, let me get it in here. Paste. All right. He says, I live in the South. Why do I ubiquitously see the Confederate flag and Trump flags flown together, but never see Democrats supporting the Confederacy? We kind of had already gotten to that a little bit, so I'll just be very brief. I think that the Confederate flag, meaning specifically the Confederate battle flag, that St. Andrew's cross on the red background with the 13 stars, I think that is more a symbol of either Southern heritage or historical preservation today than it is of racism. I think for the most part, when you see white supremacists flying a flag these days, although it can very often be that one, usually they're going to use what they call the Southern Nationalist flag, which is a white background with a black St. Andrew's cross. But nonetheless, we spent a lot of time on that, so I won't go any farther than that.
Yeah, and my answer is pretty much the same when we talked about it in the chat. Like I think that racism isn't as blatant as it was back in the day, right? In the 40s, 50s, and Jim Crow era. It's not like it used to be. It's a lot more underlying. So, there has to be an element that latches on to a symbol. So, well, I don't think it's a declaration of white supremacy like it might have been in the early 1900s or even in the 1950s or 60s. It still has that representation, and the acceptance of it is a disturbing trend in America that I find extremely disturbing. And it seems it's a conversation I'm wanting to have on a stream one day. It seems interconnected with the evangelical Christianity within the South that's kind of spread it as evangelical Christianity has spread across the nation. So, but that's something that I've correlated on my own, and I've really got to look into more before I definitively say this is something that I think we need to talk about,
Absolutely. The next question here is actually related. This comes from Ox. He says, and this one is directed at me, why is it that only Northerners and the religious hang on to the past of the South while the South has moved on and is now making money off of all those fools? I just think that's inaccurate, personally. I don't mean to be rude, but I don't think that's even close to true. For the most part, when you have statues being taken down, they're being taken down in the South. Flags being taken down, they're being taken down in the South. Stuff being renamed, it's being renamed in the South. And it's not because there isn't people in other states who have these opinions or are having these arguments. It's that there's no Lee Jackson Day in Idaho. I've never seen a statue of Robert E. Lee in my life. I guess Custer, South Dakota was going to be named Stonewall, South Dakota, because it was founded by some Confederate veterans. But that's like, a very rare sort of thing. And I don't even think most people even know where Custer, South Dakota is, other than obviously in South Dakota. So I just don't think that's accurate. I could name numerous people who fly that flag as a point of Southern heritage. Obviously, there are people outside of that, like myself, who I think have, like I've said already, a look at it as far as a symbol of historical preservation. But just to give an example, like a country singer, Upchurch, just recently got in trouble. I don't know if he's a country singer or a rapper, but whatever it is he does, he just got in trouble like 3 years ago for having a Confederate flag in his music videos, and he's from Tennessee. So yeah, I just don't think the question is accurate. And yeah, go ahead and give your thoughts there also.
Well, I definitely think it's been marketed. I think it's deliberately been marketed to reach a bigger audience. And I think it has reached a bigger audience, for sure, without a doubt. Now, does that entire audience believe in ethno-states? Of course not, right? But yeah, I definitely think that it's been utilized and marketed, and people are definitely making a lot of money off of bigotry. And it's kind of sad. Like, I'm not really for outlawing things. I would just hope, like, especially if you're like an American loving Republican, not embrace a symbol of betraying America to be your symbol of heritage, right? Like, I don't think that you can in one breath say, I love America, and then but you're saying it while you're holding a rebel flag. I think that's an oxymoron. I think it's hypocritical, and I think that it just screams idiocy, and I don't understand history.
And then the last question I'm seeing so far is for you from Rebuke and Reprove, Jill. He asks, can Rage define Southern strategy? So what do you mean by Southern strategy? Is what Jill is
asking. I mapped it out. Jill, if you want to learn about the Southern strategy, go read the Southern Manifesto. That's where it stems. Southern strategy is basically a strategy of utilizing dog whistles to grasp on to the existing racism that was in the South. And it was in the South. You were talking post Jim Crow era here. We're talking a turbulent time in American history where people are actually getting some civil rights. It took a long time to get there. It didn't happen in Reconstruction like it was supposed to. The Republicans gave way and they let the Democrats take over the South again and institute Jim Crow. So the Southern strategy is a strategy that utilized old hatreds to secure political votes. It's an electoral strategy that won them some elections. It's history. I'm sorry you don't like it.
Yeah, and so I'll just say the Southern strategy, as I see it typically defined, is and by the way, if you're willing, did have one last question he just sent in for both of us.
Sure. Yeah, no problem.
But I'll be brief. The Southern strategy, in as far as I've heard it defined, is basically a electoral strategy to try and increase the support of the white political base in the South by means of use of racist dog whistles and things like that. I don't believe that it is, as set a thing as people believe. I did say earlier, I do think there are certain ways which there was sort of an incidental or accidental.
Oh, yeah. Without a doubt, like, people utilize different strategies to win different elections. It was one of the strategies utilized in some of their elections. Yeah, I mean, I pointed it out. Like, you can just look at history when Al Gore's dad lost. Nobody expected that, and you can pretty much see it was a direct result of his support of integration that lost him support there in the South.
Yeah, and I think some of the other things you have there too is like, when the issues of states' rights. Like I said, they've been kind of inconsistent throughout time, right? And so there is an example of a lot of people who would be supporting states' rights at that time, and then they'd get support from people in the South, and I don't know, it's a weird sort of a era in a way. But yeah, that's how I typically see it defined. Last question that we have here is from Udhef, asks, one more question to both. Do you think both parties have shifted toward a single corporate party? And I'll go ahead and kind of take this first. I don't necessarily think they've shifted to be the same party per se. But in a very serious way, yes. I think Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi have far more of a political alliance with each other than, say, Ted Cruz and Mitch McConnell, or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Nancy Pelosi. I think that's definitely a fact. Now, the reason for this, I think, is a little bit complicated, but to oversimplify it tremendously, I think the establishments of either party have been pushing certain policies they did not believe in for a very long time, and this has led the base to start believing in these things. I think you see that in regards to the Tea Party, American nationalism, extreme social conservatism, limited government, stuff like that. We all tend to put those under the guise of paleo-conservatism or Burkean conservatism. You've seen that explosion really since 2010. I don't think most of the Mitch McConnells and George Bushes of the world ever believed that. But they spoke about it for so long that it was inevitably, you ended up getting that group popping up with serious power in the political right. And I think the same thing happened to the Democrats. Democrats were very often talking, oh, yeah, we're the environmental guys. We're the ones who love, the social issues of homosexuality and stuff like that. We're big on, black issues, but they didn't really mean it. But they spoke about it for so long that eventually you had people who did mean it. And so I think there is a shift that could potentially lead to a sort of melding of parties. I don't know if it would happen. I actually think in a way there's more of a division of parties, simply because I think the violence that we've seen in the last probably about 5 years, I think you could even push it back to being 6 years, but 2017, you had Berkeley, you had Charlottesville, you had the inauguration of Trump, all that kind of stuff. And so that really seems to be like the kickoff of the violence we've seen in regards to, there's been January 6th, there's been multiple shootings that have been not just mass shootings, but political in nature. There's been the 2020 thing, as far as the George Floyd riots and all that. And so really in the last 5 years, I think we've had such a shift in violence that I actually think even though those establishment guys have a lot more of alliance with each other than the fringes of each of their own party, I think we're actually farther away from unity at this point than we've probably been since the Civil War.
Well, I definitely think that there's the only time Republicans and Democrats are bipartisan is usually when it comes to big business. If you've noticed, Democrats have had power for 2 years. Have they yet to do anything about Trump's tax cuts for the rich? No, we're not taxing the rich. We're not doing anything. I disagree with CJ. I think that the base of the left have to pull our politicians kicking and screaming to social change, to where I think that politicians on the right followed their base to a core. And I think that that's the differences in the two political parties mainly. Oftentimes, like right now, it's a struggle to get the Democratic Party to recognize a livable wage. They settled on $15 an hour. We were talking about $15 an hour 10 years ago. When it comes to LGBTQ plus rights, definitely did not. We're not talking about that before the left was talking about that. We had to. Our politicians were against gay marriage until we pretty much forced their hand when we became too much for them to ignore any longer. So I definitely disagree on that. But I definitely think that there is a bipartisan level when it comes to big corporations. I think both parties have allowed the monopolization of America. I think that poor people are poorer because of it and rich people are richer. And that's how it's going to remain until both parties come together and realize that we've got to change it together. We've got to get over our little bickerings about Roe v. Wade and all the little shit. And we got to realize these motherfuckers are taken from us. to feed themselves. So I think that there definitely is, while the extremists on both sides have gained in number, I think that the core of both establishments are deeply in the pockets of corporate owners. I think that they're all lapdogs.
All righty, and with that, we are done with this debate. So if you guys liked this video, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. I'm going to try and make sure we're doing not just the podcast every Tuesday and Thursday at noon Mountain Time, but also I want to try and get at least one political debate a week. That's probably not going to happen right off of the bat. In fact, we'll probably be closer to one a month. But that's going to be the goal, is to get one of these political debates once a week and try to open up for more politics-oriented debates here on this channel. I also want to start doing things like, you go to any of these various, Tucker Carlson, Chris Matthews, any of these guys, they have somebody on at least for 10 minutes to talk about something, right? So I think we might do some more of that as well. But nonetheless, if you guys like this, please consider liking and sharing the video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit the bell to get notified every time that we go live. And thank you very much for participating in this conversation with me.
Oh, yeah. I appreciate you having me on, man.
Absolutely. We are out of here, friends. I want to remind you guys to be watchdogs and ask yourself, in the face of Armageddon, will you compromise?